The end times is a topic that has, for centuries, produced confusion, division, and dogmatism. However, as Paul noted concerning another matter, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. If God is not the source of confusion, then we need to look elsewhere to find the cause, and we do not have to look very far. In Jesus' first coming, we encounter an example of end times dogmatism, and how Jesus, the Messiah and God incarnate, understood the problem. We can learn a great deal from this conversation. When Peter confessed Jesus to be the awaited Messiah, Jesus began to tell his disciples that God's plan required him to suffer and die in Jerusalem, to which Peter objected with a rebuke. Jesus confronted Peter with an analysis of his misunderstanding. He was not tuned into God's interests, but the misguided interests of man. Later, in the home of a Roman centurion, Peter had another wake-up moment, as he realized that Messiah's blessings were not just for Jews, but that people from every nation, who fear God, and do what is right, are welcome to Israel's God. Peter did not understand that the Messiah was supposed to suffer, nor did he understand that Israel's God welcomed believing Gentiles. While their reaction did not match Peter's rebuke to Jesus, the rest of the disciples were also confused, reacting with deep grief and a failure to understand. John's Gospel records the widespread confusion and division over Jesus amongst first-century Jews, so it is fair to conclude that misunderstanding the interests of God and man was a common problem. To understand this issue, we need to investigate and distinguish God's interests and the contrary interests of man that created this problem. The Bible offers a pretty clear picture of God's interests, as well as how human interests took detours away from that path. When sin entered, God promised a male, born of a woman, would come to deal with our serpent and sin problem, striking the serpent's head, while in the confrontation, he would be wounded in the heel. Central and foundational to God's intentions and plan is a wounded Messiah. His suffering was further discussed in Psalm 2:22, Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, and Zechariah 12, verse 10. The prophets provided more information to aid people in recognizing the promised Messiah. Later, God outlined the lineage that would lead to the Messiah, from Adam to Noah, Shem to Terah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez to David. He explained to three men in that lineage, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how this would unfold. First, he would bless and protect them. Second, he would make their fleshly descendants, the 12 tribes of Jacob, or Israel, a nation in Canaan. Third, the era focused on an Israelite nation in Canaan would be followed by an age when blessings are offered to all nations, which Paul later explained was looking ahead to the present gospel age. Israel would be made a nation in Canaan under the Sinai, or Mosaic, covenant. God told them he wanted them to be an obedient, covenant-keeping kingdom of priests and a holy nation. If faithful, they would be incredibly blessed, and surrounding nations would see it, inquire, and could join that covenant, enjoy the blessings, and be prepared for the Messiah to come. To that end, God offered Israel an incredible list of perks, or blessings, for cooperating with his larger program. The Messiah arrived in Jesus, at the time predicted by Daniel, and offered a lot of evidence that he was the one predicted. While many Jews followed Jesus, he was viewed as a troublemaker by Jewish leaders, concerned about losing their influence with Rome, was arrested in Jerusalem, suffered, and in his death, he initiated the predicted new covenant, to replace the Sinai covenant. He was raised again, and then his blessings were offered to all nations, through the gospel, proclaimed by 12 men, and Paul, who he had selected as his authorized spokesman. Jesus, repeatedly, told his disciples, that his mission required him to suffer, and die, in Jerusalem, and as his death was fast approaching, Jesus, in prayer, expressed his conviction, that he was fulfilling the mission, for which he was sent. By Pentecost, Peter had finally grasped that, and told the crowds, that what happened to Jesus, was in accordance with God's predetermined plan, and foreknowledge. Soon after, he said it was what all of the prophets had been looking ahead to. In his first letter, Peter said that the prophets had been looking ahead to the current era of salvation by grace, Christ's suffering, and the good things now being announced through the gospel. Jesus will return, and he and his apostles identified what would occur with that event. A sudden separation of righteous and unrighteous. All will be gathered for final judgment and divided to eternal fates. The righteous will be given glorified immortal bodies, and a new heaven and earth will be created for the righteous. That is the biblical story, and God's interests. Don't forget, Genesis 3 not only tells us that a wounded Messiah would be coming, but also that there is a serpent, who wants to ruin God's plans, deceive people, and puts distorted ideas into the minds of men. The Bible refers to them as false prophets, false teachers, and false messiahs. Before the patriarchs, the serpent corrupted humanity to the point that God had to wipe out most with a flood. After the flood, God wanted people to repopulate and fill the earth, but the serpent encouraged them to stay together and build a great city and tower, so God divided one language into many to scatter them. After the patriarchs, when the time came for God to begin making their descendants a nation in Canaan, the train went off track again. Moses did not want to return to Egypt, to lead the Israelites to Canaan, and the Israelites did not want to leave Egypt, or enter Canaan, and a whole generation died in the wilderness. The covenant at Sinai also contained a larger list of curses for disobedience, and when Israel tended towards rebellion and idolatry, these kicked in, and became the problems Israel experienced, between 1360 and 586 BC, culminating in the ultimate curse of losing possession of the Promised Land. When Israel entered Canaan, they only conquered part of it, and left many Canaanites who would trouble them, then forgot Yahweh, intermarried with the Canaanites, and worshipped their gods for the next 300 years. By the end of the period of the Judges, Israel had forgotten that God was their king, and they wanted an earthly monarchy, so they could imitate their pagan neighbors. God warned them it was a bad idea, but they persisted, and he let them learn the hard way. Solomon reinstituted Canaanite idolatry, and after God divided the monarchy, it continued in both kingdoms. God eventually demolished both kingdoms, sending both into foreign exile. Israel went into Assyrian exile in 722 BC, with a bill of divorce, while Judah went to Babylon for 70 years, in several stages beginning in 606 BC, but was allowed to return to the land, until the Messiah from the tribe of Judah arrived. As Judah was heading into the Babylonian exile, Jeremiah foretold that God would make a new covenant with Israel and Judah, and it would be different from the Mosaic covenant, more suited for the age when Messiah's blessings would be offered to all nations. The Messiah arrived on schedule in Jesus, but their rabbis had concocted and taught an imagined scenario for the Messiah and last days that did not match God's intentions, or the prophetic portrayal of Messiah and what he would do. For more on 1st century rabbinic teaching, see the video, The Messiah and the End Times, according to 1st century rabbis. In a nutshell, the rabbis had changed the story. The wounded Messiah, blessings offered to all nations or Gentiles, and the new covenant, were gone, deleted from the rabbis' version of God's interests. To the rabbis, everything revolves around the Jewish nation, in Canaan, under the Sinai covenant. God would gather all Jews to Palestine, then Gentile armies would surround and assault Jerusalem. The Messiah would appear to rescue the Jews, and then he would restore and rebuild Jerusalem and temple and rule over a glorious earthly Jewish kingdom. The law, prophets, and writings were recorded on 22 or 24 scrolls of processed animal skin, and quite expensive, so most could not afford them, and were very dependent on the rabbis for their understanding of the law and prophets. First century Jews had trouble recognizing Jesus as Messiah, because they were expecting the Messiah and last days, as imagined by the rabbis. In their scenario, the wounded Messiah, age of blessings offered to all nations, and new covenant, had disappeared. This is why Peter reacted so violently to Jesus' assertion that he had to suffer and die in Jerusalem, and the others were confused. This is why Paul had to remind Jews in synagogues, and King Agrippa, that the law and prophets had foretold the Messiah's suffering, but the rabbis had changed God's story. Like Jonah, Peter needed an eye-opener about Israel's God caring about and welcoming believing Gentiles. Jesus differed with the rabbis on many points, and was quite critical of them. Many Jews did see enough in Jesus that they followed him. After the 11 disciples, there were at least 120. On Pentecost, 30 AD, there were 3,000 men, and soon, 5,000 men. All of these had to do a lot of rethinking to evaluate and reject enough of the rabbinic scenario that they could embrace and commit themselves to Jesus. An end times scenario, called dispensational premillennialism, with roots in Catholic scholars, Ribera, Bellarmine, and Lacunza, between 1570 and 1800, was adopted into Protestant circles through Edward Irving, J. N. Darby, C. I. Schofield, and Clarence Larkin, between 1800 and the 1920s. Many were attracted to it through the writings of Hal Lindsey, Jack Van Impe, and Salem Caban, in the 1970s. Then, Tim LaHaye's left behind books in the later 1990s. YouTube videos in abundance keep promoting the newest versions of this same scenario. So, what are these folks saying about the Messiah, end times, and God's interests? Again, everything revolves around the Jewish nation in Canaan, under the Sinai covenant. Jesus came the first time, intending to establish and rule a glorious, earthly, Jewish kingdom, but failed, and had to postpone it. The current age of gospel and grace, when Messiah's blessings are offered to all nations, was totally unknown to the prophets and not predicted. Towards the end of this age, the Jews will be regathered to Palestine, and will be attacked by Gentile armies. Jesus will return to rescue the Jews, restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and from it rule an earthly Jewish kingdom for 1,000 years. Sound familiar? Again, the wounded Messiah is not the centerpiece God intended. The predicted new covenant, inaugurated with Jesus' blood, is virtually forgotten. The era of Messiah's blessings, being offered to all nations, is now viewed as unknown to the prophets. A plan B, put in place until God can get back to resuming his real focus, the Jewish nation in Palestine, under the Sinai covenant. If you compare what the Bible tells us about God's larger plan with the first century rabbinic scenario and dispensational premillennialism, the contrast is obvious. God's plan was built on the promise of a wounded Messiah. Then promises to the patriarchs of personal blessings and protection. Their descendants would be made a nation in Canaan, guided by the Sinai covenant. Then Messiah would suffer for sin, and inaugurate the predicted new covenant, for the final era, when his blessings would be offered to all nations, through the gospel. In the 1st century, Rabbinic scenario, the wounded Messiah, blessings to all nations or Gentiles, and new covenant, all of which were foretold in the prophets, disappeared. Instead, it's all about the Israelite nation in Canaan, and the Sinai covenant. Jews would be regathered to Palestine, assaulted by Gentile armies. Messiah would appear to rescue the Jews, restore Jerusalem, and rule over a glorious Jewish kingdom. Modern dispensationalism, obviously, embraced the rabbinical scenario with a slight adjustment. For Jesus' failed attempt to establish the Jewish kingdom, which he was forced to postpone. After the current grace and gospel age for Gentiles, totally unpredicted and unknown to the prophets, the Jews will regather in Palestine, be assaulted by Gentile armies, and Jesus will return to rescue the Jews and begin ruling the postponed Jewish kingdom. The old conflict between God's interests and the interests of man continues.